Writing name of the following Member of Parliament correct, the Honourable Member of Wellington Halton Hills.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a welcome recognition this time. I rise to remark on the life of the Right Honourable Brian Mulroney in the hope of looking at his life as a way for us to look toward the future. Mr. Speaker, I was a young grade 11 student at Centre Wellington District High School in Wellington County in 1988 when I joined the Conservative Party. I was in grade 11 at the time, and there was an upcoming election that would take place later that fall. And in that spring, I joined the party to campaign for my local Member of Parliament at the time, who has become a very good friend, the Honourable Perrin Beattie. And that was my first step into the life of politics. And I clearly remember why I joined the party. I clearly remember why I helped campaign for Perrin Beattie in 1988 as a young high school student. And that was because I believed in the vision that Brian Mulroney outlined for this country. It was the free trade election that many have referenced in this House. It was a big shift in Canadian policy, the free trade agreement between Canada and the United States. In fact, it was arguably the biggest shift in foreign policy in Canada in a century, since the reciprocity election, I believe, of 1911, where Prime Minister Laurier argued for free trade and the Conservatives of the day argued against, in favor of what was called the national policy. And Canadians at that time decided against free trade and decided to implement a series of tariff barriers to protect domestic industry and to shield domestic industry from foreign competition. And Brian Mulroney, after listening to experts in 1986 and 87, decided that it was time to spend some political capital and to convince Canadians that doing away with this over 100-year policy that Sir John A. Macdonald had implemented, the national policy, in order to ensure our future prosperity. And that's exactly what he did. The '88 free trade election was arguably one of the only recent modern elections that we have had that has been an election about foreign policy, because it essentially was about Canada's relationship with the United States. And I joined the party at that time as a young teenager, as a high school student, because I believed in his vision, in his confidence in what this country was and what this country could be. And when we look at the track record of the Mulroney government, we see a remarkable record. They implemented the last series of big tax reforms that we have seen. We all know about the 1971 tax reforms that were a result of the Carter Commission. But many of us have forgotten the reforms of 1987 and 1988 and subsequently in the early 1990s. The Mulroney government took 10 federal tax brackets and reduced them to 3 federal brackets. They eliminated a punitive 13.5% manufacturer sales tax and replaced it with a value-added goods and services tax that expert economists had been arguing for since the early 1970s, all in an effort to unleash the productive capacity of the Canadian economy. They implemented monetary policy reform at the Bank of Canada under the leadership of then-Governor John Crow by implementing inflation targeting of 2%, which is with us to this day. And they privatized and deregulated many, many industries, unleashing productivity and growth and job creation in those industries. And on top of doing all of that, they actually brought the budget over their term in government to an operating surplus. And the reason why that is significant in today's context is that it was the Mulroney government that was the last government in this country to meet our NATO 2% defense spending commitment. That was the last time Canada met its 2% defense spending commitment. It was also the last time that we came the closest to meeting the overseas development assistance goal of spending 0.7% of gross national income on aid to the world's most vulnerable and poorest. It was also the government that was ambitious in its foreign policy when it came to the environment. It was the government that helped put in place the Montreal Protocol, which banned substances that contained chlorine and bromine that came into effect in 1989 that effectively helped close off the ozone hole, which continues to be repaired to this day as a result of that protocol. It was the government that implemented what we now call the Acid Rain Treaty, which was known as the Air Quality Agreement, that convinced Republican President Ronald Reagan to sign on to such an agreement and his successor, George Bush, in order to deacidify the freshwater lakes in much of Canada, particularly throughout the Canadian Shield, many of which lakes had become dead lakes because they had become so acidic that they no longer could support the native flora and fauna they once did. It was the government that introduced the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, something near and dear to my heart as an Ontario MP, which touches on 4 of the 5 Great Lakes which hold 1/5 of all the surface fresh water on the planet. This was a government that accomplished these foreign policy goals in the environment, in defense, and in overseas development assistance, all the while bringing the Government of Canada's operating budget to surplus during the 9 years that they were in power. And on top of all that, Prime Minister Mulroney led the charge at the Commonwealth to stand up against an apartheid regime in South Africa, and was a leader in joining with allies on so many other initiatives. But, Mr. Speaker, perhaps the greatest accomplishment of Prime Minister Brian Mulroney was to instill in this country a confidence about who we are and what we could be. He was the Prime Minister that said to Canadian businesses, "You can compete with the best in the world. You don't need a tariff wall to protect you from competition, because I know Canada, and I know Canadians, and I know Canadian businesses, and I know that they are excellent, and I know they can compete with the best in the world." He instilled in our academic researchers that same kind of confidence with the initiatives they undertook to fund post-secondary education and research. He instilled in all parts of the country this idea that Canada had boundless potential and that it was only limited by our own limited horizons about what we could be. And that perhaps is his greatest accomplishment, instilling in a new generation of Canadians who would later follow him to serve in this House and who hopefully will come to serve in subsequent parliaments, the idea that we can be the best in the world and that we can compete with the best in the world and that we can strive for excellence and we can achieve excellence. And so, Mr. Speaker, I want to thank Mr. Mulroney for his contributions to this country. I want to particularly thank his family, Mila, Caroline, Ben, Mark, and Nicholas, for the sacrifices that they made over so many years in allowing their father and their husband to donate and contribute so much to this country we call home. Thank you.